good evening, and welcome back to Tranquil Arc Chronicles, endless horrories for sleepless nights. Tonight, the fog curls low over London. The lamps along Westminster Bridge burn dimly, their light muffled by the soot-thick mist. Somewhere beyond the Thames, a bell tolls, slow, mournful, and precise. It's nearly midnight, but listen closely. Beneath the sound of the bell, there's something else. A hum, a distant churning, the faint metallic sigh of a train that should not be running at this hour. Its whistle is not sharp, but hollow, as though blown through by the wind that passes between gravestones. Once, they said this train was a marvel, a triumph of Victorian innovation, built to carry coffins and mourners to the vast new necropolis beyond the city, a place where the dead could rest away from the living. It was practical, efficient, and perhaps a little too ambitious, for death, as London would soon learn, does not take kindly to being scheduled. Close your eyes. Imagine the year is 1866. Steam curls above rooftops. Horses clatter on cobblestones, slick with rain, and the great railway lines stretch like veins across England's beating heart. But in one corner of the city, hidden between rows of ivy-strangled tombs, a station stands silent. Its sign, half lost to rust, still reads, London Necropolis Station. The trains here run only by night. Their passengers are quiet, too quiet. And sometimes, when the lamps flicker, when the city sleeps, there are those who swear they see figures standing at the platform, clutching faded tickets, waiting for a train that never seems to stop, or perhaps one that never truly left. Chapter 1. Whispers on the rails. Fog had always been part of London's soul. It hid the soot, softened the stench, blurred the edges of the world until truth and illusion were one. But that night, the fog felt different, alive, somehow, humming faintly with the pulse of the iron tracks beneath. Thomas Ellard felt it before he heard it. He was a railway night watchman, 42, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by coal dust and long shifts. His post was simple: ensure the gates of the Necropolis line remained closed after midnight. No trains were scheduled past 11. None were meant to run, and certainly none had for years. Yet that night, the ground trembled softly. He paused mid-step, his lantern swinging, casting long shadows that danced across the marble faces of headstones lining the cemetery fence. The sound came faint at first, the distant rumble of metal wheels against track, low and steady. A train. Thomas frowned, glancing down the rail line. The fog thickened, heavy as breath, glowing faintly orange where the city lights struggled through. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a flicker of gold, the glint of a headlamp, perhaps, but then it was gone, swallowed whole by the mist. He exhaled. Just the wind, he told himself, or the echo of the goods line. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation of movement. not in front of him, but behind. Turning, Thomas caught sight of the marble angel at the cemetery gate, wings darkened by soot, eyes downcast. Its shadow, cast by his lantern, seemed longer than it should have been, wider, almost human in shape. "Bloody fog," he muttered, and began walking again. The iron gate creaked shut behind him. But then the whistle, low, mournful, drawn from the depths of the earth. Thomas froze. The sound rolled across the cemetery, a whisper threaded through the wind. Hoo-oh! No ordinary train made that sound. He lifted his lantern high, scanning the rails. The fog parted for just a heartbeat, enough for him to see the faint shimmer of steel trembling. Then the air itself seemed to shift. Cold poured around him, sudden and absolute. The flame in his lantern flickered, bent backward, and almost died. And then he saw it, a light, small and yellow, blooming from the far end of the track. Then another, behind it, and another, lanterns, strung along the side of a train emerging from the fog. It moved soundlessly, its great iron wheels turning without rhythm, without steam, without sound of effort. A ghost of a train. Thomas's jaw slackened. "Impossible," he breathed. The engine that rolled toward him was unlike any he'd seen, ornate, black with silver filigree curling along its sides, its windows shrouded by curtains. No smoke rose from the chimney, no glow from the furnace, yet its headlamp burned steady and gold, cutting the fog like a wound. The hum of its passage felt like something deep in the bones of the earth, ancient, mournful. Thomas stumbled back, nearly dropping his lantern. He should have run, but something in the sight held him still. Awe, dread, fascination. The train slowed as it neared the gate, hissing faintly like breath through teeth. Through the misted glass of the first carriage, he saw movement, a silhouette seated by the window. A woman, pale, unmoving. Another figure beside her, then another. Row upon row of still passengers, their faces half hidden by shadow. And then he saw the conductor, tall, gaunt, dressed in black, his hat tilted low, his gloved hand clutching a silver pocket watch. Slowly, the conductor turned his head toward Thomas. Though the distance was great, Thomas felt the gaze like a physical weight. "Who goes there?" Thomas called, his voice unsteady. "This line's closed. You've no right running here." The conductor didn't reply. Instead, he lifted the pocket watch, clicked it open, and examined it closely. Then, as if satisfied, he raised one gloved finger and pointed directly at Thomas. The train's whistle shrieked again, this time piercing and clear, and the carriages blurred, first solid, then translucent, then gone altogether as the fog swallowed everything once more. Silence. Thomas staggered back, breath ragged, heart hammering. The rails before him gleamed wetly, untouched. No wheel marks, no fresh soot, nothing but still air and faint vibration beneath his boots. For a long time he stood there, staring, when at last he turned back toward the city. The angel statue behind him had shifted, its stone face lifted slightly, its lips parted just enough to catch the fog. By dawn, the fog had lifted. The necropolis line stood quiet again. The records from that night would show nothing unusual. But the night watchman never returned for his next shift, and the lantern he carried was found days later, lying upright on the tracks, still burning. Chapter 2: The First Departure, London, 1867. The year the fog learned to whisper. The city was still black with soot and sorrow when the sun failed to rise that Tuesday morning. The streets of Waterloo were empty, save for the dull flicker of gas lamps and the squeal of a carriage wheel cutting through the mist. Inside that fog, time seemed hesitant. Every clock ticked a little slower. Every echo lingered a breath too long. At the edge of Westminster Bridge Road stood the London Necropolis railway station, a place where the living bought one-way tickets for the dead. It had been built out of necessity during the cholera epidemics and overcrowded graveyards of the 1850s. A separate platform, separate carriages, even separate fares, all carefully arranged to ferry coffins and mourners from the choking heart of the city to the quieter embrace of Brookwood Cemetery, 30 miles away. The timetable was precise, solemn. The trains ran at dawn, at noon, and, on rare occasions, at midnight. That night was one such occasion. The midnight fair for mourners gathered under the dim station canopy. Their black umbrellas gleamed with drizzle. Their faces, pale and worn, caught the lamplight like marble effigies. At their center stood Eleanor Blackwood, widow of the recently deceased industrialist Charles Blackwood, a man of many factories and few friends. She was veiled in mourning lace, her gloved hand clutching a silver pocket watch that no longer ticked. Beside her was her brother, Dr. Silas Penryn, physician to the poorer wards of Lambeth. His eyes were red, not from grief but sleeplessness. He had spent the day writing a letter to the hospital board about inexplicable cardiac failures. Among his patients' hearts, stopping mid-beat as though synchronized with an unseen rhythm, two more companions joined them. Margaret Blythe, the governess who had raised the Blackwood children, now long dead of fever. Mr. Jerome Vance, a solicitor with a waxy complexion and a fondness for night air. The ticketmaster, a short man with a lantern and a quill, greeted them with uneasy courtesy. First class, 4 mourners, 1 coffin, destination, Brookwood. Eleanor nodded. He wished to be buried before the dawn. The clerk hesitated. A midnight departure is irregular, madame. The company discourages. Mr. Blackwood was a shareholder, interrupted Vance sharply. We were told the arrangements were authorized. The clerk said nothing more. He stamped their tickets and handed them over with a trembling hand. When he turned to record the entry in his logbook, the ink bled across the paper in a peculiar way, as though something unseen had brushed against the nib. At the bottom of the page, beneath the new names, an older entry caught his eye, faint, smudged, dated November 14th, 1854. Thomas Ellard Porter, 2nd class, status, missing. The clerk blinked. The entry hadn't been there yesterday. The train that waited the Necropolis train stood alone on the siding, its iron frame dripping with dew, its windows dark as obsidian. The carriages were labeled in gilt letters: mourners, 1st class, coffins, 2nd, and furthest from the light, staff, and clergy. The locomotive itself bore a curious name: Perseverance. Yet the brass plate below it seemed newly engraved, the letters sharp and cold. Some claimed it hadn't steamed for years. Others whispered it moved on its own when the fog was thickest. As the coffin was loaded into the freight carriage, a gust of wind shivered through the fog, carrying a faint echo, the metallic rhythm of footsteps, out of time with their own. Eleanor turned, expecting a porter. There was none. Only the rails glistened, and beyond them the black mouth of the tunnel gaped like an open grave, among the living and the dead. Once seated, the mourners found the interior unnervingly still. The lamps flickered low, though no one had lit them. A scent of camphor and iron hung in the air. Dr. Penryn adjusted his gloves, muttering about the miasmatic vapors of the line. But his words trailed off as the carriage began to hum, a soft vibration rising from beneath their feet. Margaret Blythe clutched her rosary. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor leaned forward. "It's only the steam engine." "No, dear, that isn't steam. It's breathing." The solicitor laughed faintly, though the sound had no warmth. "You've been reading too many penny dreadfuls, Mrs. Blythe. This train carries the dead, not ghosts." But when the whistle sounded, no smoke rose from the funnel. Instead, a cold mist poured inward through the seams of the carriage, pale and deliberate, curling around their ankles like a sentient fog. And then the wheels began to turn. The whistle without steam outside, the city receded into obscurity. The iron bridges, the flickering gas lamps, even the sound of the Thames, all faded into an impossible silence. No clatter, no rhythm of rails, only a deep, resonant pulse like the slow heartbeat of something ancient beneath the earth. Inside the passenger car, Eleanor's watch began ticking again, though she had not wound it. Tick, tick, tick each. Sound echoed faintly from the coffin compartment ahead. Dr. Penryn stood to investigate, pulling open the compartment door, and froze. The coffin lid was moving, fractionally, in rhythm with the ticking. Not rising, just shifting, like something breathing beneath it. The man who shouldn't be there. When Penryn staggered back into the passenger car, he nearly collided with a stranger seated at the far end. The man was dressed like a railway porter, gray waistcoat, cap in hand, eyes downcast. But the air around him shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from his outline. Eleanor blinked. You weren't aboard when we departed." The man looked up, his expression distant. "No, ma'am, I never left." His voice was calm, toneless, hollow. Margaret gasped. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "I've been riding this line since the first night it ran. Name's Ellard, Thomas Ellard." Dr. Penryn dropped his lantern. The flame guttered, then vanished. The forgotten conductor Ellard's story unfolded like the hiss of escaping air. He had worked for the Necropolis Company in its earliest days, guiding funeral trains through fog and moonlight. But one night, after a cholera epidemic, a special run was arranged, a late departure carrying unclaimed bodies, and a single coffin marked "reserved for repatriation." The record said the train derailed near Woking Junction. Ellard said it never stopped. Something had entered the train from the shadows. Not a man, not a ghost, but a reflection without a source. And when it touched the engine, the steam turned black. "The company buried an empty coffin," Ellard whispered. "And every few years, when the city's grief grows heavy enough, the train comes back to collect its due." He raised his eyes, pale, unblinking. "And now you've boarded it." The cemetery of mirrors. As the train neared the cemetery grounds, the fog outside thickened until even the windows became mirrors. In them, the mourners saw not their own faces, but strangers, pale copies with sunken eyes and open mouths. Dr. Penryn's reflection smiled, though he did not. Margaret's hands clasped her throat in the glass, not in reality. Eleanor's veil lifted slowly, though the air was still. Ellard's reflection was missing entirely. Then, one by one, the lamps extinguished. The first departure. The train stopped without sound. Outside, the cemetery gates swung open on their own. Eleanor rose, trembling. "Are we?" "Arrived," Ellard nodded. "Arrival is only for the living." When the doors opened, the world outside was not Brookwood. It was the same station they had left, the Necropolis platform, but older, crumbling, overtaken by moss and silence. The sign read, "Last departure, minus 1854. Dr. Penryn stepped out, shouting, but his voice didn't echo. He turned and saw their own train still waiting on the opposite platform, gleaming, empty, untouched by time. A figure moved inside that other train. It was them, the living, watching the dead depart. The whistle calls again when the whistle blew once more. The mourners found themselves weightless, their forms fading like breath on glass. Only Eleanor remained clear-eyed, gripping her husband's coffin. "You took him," she whispered. "Now take me." Ellard bowed slightly, his form flickering like a dying flame. "The train chooses, ma'am." "Not one." The final whistle echoed, soft as a sigh, and the train slid backward into the fog, leaving behind no tracks, no sound, no breath of steam. Only a logbook page fluttered in the empty station office, inked freshly with new names: Eleanor Blackwood, Dr. Silas Penryn, Margaret Blythe, Jerome Vance. Status: departed. Below them, faint but legible: Thomas Ellard, still aboard. Epilogue: the Echo Line in 2025. Railway workers, restoring an abandoned tunnel beneath Waterloo, discovered a corroded brass plate engraved Perseverance. When they photographed it, the camera showed 5 figures standing behind them, faint, translucent, dressed in Victorian mourning attire. The file was later deleted, but the sound remained. A single whistle, faint and endless, drifting beneath the Thames. End of Chapter 2, The First Departure. Chapter 3, The Dead Return Ticket. The clock strikes 12 again, and somewhere beneath the streets of London, the rails hum with a sound no timetable records. The Archive beneath Waterloo, London, 1923. Progress had crept in like a polite intruder. Electric trams rattled across the bridges. Phonographs crackled jazz where once had been hymns. Yet deep beneath the Waterloo arches, a forgotten doorway stood sealed with a rusted iron plate, marked faintly with 2 words, long erased by soot and rain: Necropolis Line. The world above had forgotten it, or perhaps chosen to. The last official funeral train had run decades earlier, when war had filled the cemeteries faster than the railway could carry coffins. But archivist Samuel Harker, newly appointed to the Metropolitan Railway Office of Historical Records, had found something that wouldn't let him rest. It was a logbook, misfiled in a crate of cholera reports. The handwriting was elegant but erratic, the ink faded to brown. Each entry listed departures, not by time, but by name. The final line chilled him most: Eleanor Blackwood, Dr. Silas Penryn, Margaret Blythe, Jerome Vance. Status: departed. Thomas Ellard, still aboard. The date read 1867, but at the very bottom of the page, scrawled in newer ink, shakier, hurried, was something impossible: scheduled return pending. The tunnel that waited Harker was not a man of imagination. He catalogued papers, indexed maps, and drank tea that had long since lost its warmth. But that night, as the rain whispered against the glass ceiling of the archive, he felt an urge that was neither scholarly nor sane. He took a lantern, a camera, and the old logbook. The maintenance staff had left hours earlier. The station above echoed faintly with the footfalls of the last train to Portsmouth. Beyond platform 16 lay a sealed service door, chained, forgotten. Harker had found its mention in an 1853 blueprint labeled Auxiliary Line to Brookwood, Restricted. He pried the chain loose. It fell with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air smelled of old metal and forgotten breath. Dust floated in thick sheets, illuminated by his lantern beam. He followed the narrow passage down a spiral stair, then through a brick archway that opened into what once had been a platform, the Necropolis station. The signs still hung crookedly from the ceiling. The iron benches were skeletal, yet the rails were clean. No rust, no dust, as though something still used them. Then he saw it, faint, silver, motionless in the dark. A train. The train with no engine. It stood silent, half-formed in the mist that coiled around it. The lamps along its carriages glowed dimly, though no electricity ran there. The windows reflected nothing, not even Harker's light. He stepped closer, trembling. His breath came in clouds that didn't disperse. The brass plate on the engine read, "Perseverance," exactly as in the logbook. But the strangest thing was this: there was no locomotive, only the carriages, sitting neatly on the tracks, disconnected, and yet humming faintly as if power pulsed through their frames. Harker reached for his camera, but before he could lift it, the first door clicked open. The passenger, without reflection, a woman, stepped out. Her dress was Victorian mourning black, but the fabric shimmered faintly, as if woven from smoke. A black veil covered her face. She did not walk so much as glide. "Who's there?" Harker demanded, though his voice sounded childlike in the vast chamber. The woman tilted her head. "Is it 1867 still?" Harker froze. "No, it's 1923. She touched her veil lightly. "Ah, then it has been 56 years since our departure." Her tone was calm, resigned, almost tender. Harker swallowed. You mean the Blackwood party?" The woman's veil turned toward him, though no eyes were visible, so the ledger remains. "Does it still mark us departed?" Harker nodded slowly. "Then it lies," she whispered, "because one of us returned." The train door behind her swung open with a groan. Inside, the corridor glowed faintly blue. For an instant, Harker thought he saw 4 silhouettes standing motionless, as if still seated where death had found them. The 5th shadow moved, the reflection in the lens. Harker lifted his camera and snapped a photograph. The bulb flashed, blinding him momentarily. When his vision cleared, the woman was gone. The carriage doors were shut again. He stumbled backward, clutching the camera like a shield. The sound that followed was soft, a whistle, not from steam, but from inside the tunnel. A long, low note that seemed to draw the air out of his lungs. He ran, back through the archway, up the spiral stair, until he burst into the light of the archive. The rain had stopped. The clocks read 12:01 a.m., but when he looked at his reflection in the glass cabinet, he froze. The reflection behind him, a woman in black, smiled. The photograph. The next morning, Harker developed the photograph. It showed the platform as he had seen it, the old carriage, the fog, the glimmer of the brass plate. But faintly visible in the doorway of the first car was a man, gaunt, cap pulled low, face blurred by motion. Below the negative, where the developer fluid had pooled. Words appeared in silver streaks. Thomas Ellard, still aboard. Harker's hands trembled. The message wasn't etched. It had formed naturally, like the emulsion itself had rearranged to write it. He turned the photo over and gasped. Someone had already written a note on the back in his own handwriting. Scheduled return -1923. The whistle that calls the dead. That evening, Harker's colleagues found him sitting in the archive reading room, staring at the photograph. He didn't speak, didn't blink. When they touched his shoulder, he finally looked up. "Do you hear it?" he asked softly. "It's calling." "What is?" "The train." He smiled faintly, as though remembering something sweet. "It doesn't need tracks anymore. It travels where there's grief." Within the week, Harker vanished. His coat and lantern were later discovered near platform 16. The photograph had disappeared. But that same night, a signalman at Brookwood Junction reported something impossible. A light, faint and gold, racing down a sealed tunnel that hadn't been used since 1902. He swore he heard the sound of a whistle echo through the soil. The passenger returns. 3 nights later, a woman was found wandering near the Brookwood Cemetery gates. She was dressed in black Victorian clothing, barefoot, soaked in dew. Her hands were folded around a tarnished silver watch. When questioned, she said she'd missed her connection and needed to find Dr. Penryn. No such person existed in the town's records. At the local morgue, when they took her photograph, the image showed her face clearly, serene, ageless, but in the reflection of the camera lens, there were 5 figures standing behind her. One of them was Samuel Harker. The company reactivates in 1924. The London Necropolis Company quietly reopened the tunnel for inspection. The engineers sealed it again after reporting electrical anomalies. Gauges misreading, compasses spinning, lamps flickering out of sync. The foreman filed an internal memo. Something hums below the platform. It vibrates like a living thing. When we tap the rails, they echo back like a heartbeat. The memo was never signed. The inspection crew disappeared 2 days later. In the next month, railway telegraph operators across London began receiving fragments of messages on unused lines, dots and dashes, forming words that repeated over and over. Return scheduled departure. Confirmed no one ever traced the source. The conductor's ledger, a century later, in 2025, a rail historian restoring Harker's archives discovered a second logbook, one never catalogued before. Inside were 2 distinct handwritings, Harker's and another, older style. The entries began in 1854. They ended in 1923. The final page was dated today. It read, "The cemetery train, active line, Perseverance, operational, next stop, wherever the living remember the dead." And at the bottom, freshly inked, though the pen lay dry. Conductor Thomas Ellard, archivist Samuel Harker, passengers to be determined. When the historian looked up, the glass cabinet across the room reflected a faint glow, like a train's headlamp cutting through fog. And from nowhere, soft and steady, came the sound of a whistle. Chapter 4. The Conductor's Promise, London, winter of 1924. The fog had grown heavier that year, as though the city itself had begun to rot from the inside. The return to the rails, the air above Waterloo Station, smelled of coal, rain, and the weary sighs of a city rebuilding itself after war. Beneath it, where the old necropolis line slept behind bricked-up walls and disused tunnels, that smell changed to iron, damp stone, and something older still. Inspector Henry Calthorpe didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in reports, in ledgers, in clean ink, and verifiable cause. But the file he'd been handed by the Ministry of Transport had no such comfort, no dates, no stamps, only 3 trembling words penciled in at the top: the train returns. The signature beneath the report was Samuel Harker's, and Harker, officially, had been missing for 13 months. Maintenance, irregularities, unexplained lights, phantom telegraph signals, Calthorpe muttered as he read. Bloody nonsense. Still, he went, because London was cracking at its seams, tunnels collapsing, platforms flooding, power surges frying half the signal boxes south of the Thames. Every time the failures occurred, one pattern repeated, 12 a.m. exactly, and always near the line that no longer existed. The record keeper. He found Margaret Tinsley, the only clerk who'd known Harker well enough to recall his habits. She worked in a tiny office filled with papers that smelled faintly of mildew and lilacs, the scent she used to keep her headaches away. Harker, she said softly, her fingers tightening around her teacup. He was quiet, always humming, had a fondness for records no one cared to open. What about his disappearance? Margaret hesitated. The night before he went missing, he left a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. I only saw the first line before the constables took it. Calthorpe waited. She swallowed. It said, "If the whistle sounds, do not look into the glass." The inspector frowned. The glass? There's an old superstition, she said. Workers who built the tunnels claimed that glass reflected not just what stood before it, but what passed beneath it. Her voice trembled slightly. They said the dead still traveled under the city, on the old line, the unmarked platform that night. Calthorpe descended with 2 constables into the sealed section beneath Waterloo. It had taken weeks of permissions and a bribe or 2 to get the key. The corridors were colder than he expected. The deeper they went, the more their lamps flickered, like the air itself refused light. When they reached the arch-marked necropolis, the chains were already broken. "Someone's been here recently," one constable murmured. Calthorpe raised his lantern and froze. The platform stretched before them exactly as it had in Harker's photograph. Only now the rails gleamed wet, as if freshly polished, and on the far end a faint shape wavered in the fog, a single carriage black as ink, its brass fixtures gleaming faintly. The door was open. Calthorpe felt his throat tighten. Steady. We approach slow. They stepped forward. The sound of their boots echoed softly, rhythmically, click-clack, click-clack, until it began to match another sound, the low, drawn-out hum of an unseen engine. Then came the whistle, so soft it was almost mistaken for a sigh. When it faded, one of the constables was gone. The conductor's seat, Calthorpe turned sharply. Harrison, only silence answered. The other constable pointed toward the carriage. He was just behind me. Then both men saw it, a faint movement through the fogged window, a figure walking inside the carriage, pacing steadily from end to end. Calthorpe swung the door open and stepped in. The air inside was freezing, yet the lamps glowed faintly blue. The seats were perfectly arranged, as though awaiting passengers. At the far end sat a man in a dark conductor's coat, cap low, gloved hands folded on his lap. His head was bowed. "Who are you?" Calthorpe demanded. The figure lifted his head slowly. The face was pale, wax-like, the eyes hollow but aware. "Tickets, please." The voice was calm, almost polite, and unmistakably human. Calthorpe took a step back. You're from this line. Every man rides his own line," the conductor said. "Yours just began." He reached into his coat and pulled out something that gleamed in the lamplight, a silver pocket watch. Calthorpe saw the inscription and felt his pulse stop. "Thomas Ellard, conductor." "The promise I've read about you," Calthorpe whispered. "You vanished in 1867. Ellard smiled faintly, the corners of his lips cracking like old parchment. "I did not vanish. I fulfilled the promise." "What promise?" "That all who step aboard reach their destination, even if their bodies cannot. We simply collect what's forgotten." As he spoke, the shadows outside began to move, dozens of faint, blurred forms pacing along the platform, faces without features, coats that fluttered without wind. Calthorpe backed away, toward the door, heart hammering. "Stay back." But Ellard only nodded gently. "It's not me you should fear, Inspector. It's the return ticket." The whistle blows suddenly. The carriage lurched. The platform slid away as though the world itself were in motion. The constable screamed, or perhaps that sound came from the rails. Outside, darkness streaked past the windows, not the black of tunnels, but of something far deeper, a void lit only by the occasional flash of dim lanterns. Faces pressed to glass, whispering in languages long forgotten. The inspector gripped a seat to steady himself. "Stop this train." "It cannot stop," Ellard said simply. It must always return. Calthorpe tried to reach for his revolver, but when he looked down, his hand was translucent, like smoke. Illard turned the pocket watch toward him. Time, you see, runs differently once the ticket is punched. He opened his gloved hand. There, lying in his palm, was a small brass ticket engraved with 2 words, Henry Calthorpe, passenger. The station of echoes when Calthorpe awoke. The train had stopped. Fog pressed against the windows. Beyond it stretched a vast, silent platform, white marble cracked with moss. Hundreds of benches covered in dust. On the far wall hung a clock with no hands. Illard stood by the door. "Your stop," he said. Calthorpe rose unsteadily. "Where is this?" "The in-between," Illard replied, "where those who listen to the whistle too long arrive." The inspector's voice trembled. "And if I step off," Illard smiled faintly, "then you'll know what the dead never say aloud." Calthorpe turned toward the window and froze. His reflection wasn't his own. It was Harker's. The ledger of the departed. Days later, Margaret Tinsley received a parcel at her office. No return address. Inside was a tarnished pocket watch and a folded page from an official logbook. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet elegant. Necropolis Line Departures. Henry Calthorpe departed. Status en route. Next passenger. Pending. The watch ticked once, then stopped. She placed it in her desk drawer, locked it, and whispered a quiet prayer, though she wasn't sure to whom. That night, as the city slept, Margaret dreamt of a distant whistle. In her dream, she stood on a fog-shrouded platform, surrounded by countless others waiting silently, faces turned toward an approaching light, the ticket window. Weeks later, Waterloo Station began reporting strange disturbances. Commuters heard train whistles when none were scheduled. A night porter swore he desold a ticket to a man in black for a midnight departure to Brookwood, though no such train existed. By morning, the porter was gone. His booth, however, was neatly arranged, save for one brass ticket lying on the counter. Stamped into it were 2 words, "Return pending." The conductor's shadow in a disused corridor behind platform 16, where the old line's arch still remained sealed. A shadow sometimes moves when the last train leaves the station. Maintenance men say they hear footsteps pacing on the other side, slow and steady, like a man walking his route. Some claim to hear the faint clink of a watch chain, or a voice murmuring softly, "Tickets, please." And if you listen long enough, they say, you'll see your own reflection, watching from the glass, but not moving when you do. End of Chapter 4. The Conductor's Promise. Chapter 5. The Cemetery Line, London, awakens to a rumor by spring of 1925. The city had started to whisper again. It began with the newspaper clippings, small, almost absurd items tucked between war deaths and shipping reports. Midnight train heard beneath Waterloo workers, refuse graveyard shift. Woman claims husband boarded. Phantom carriage returns home with silver ticket. No one took them seriously, not at first. London was filled with stories, tales of seance, parlors, spirit photographers, and underground mystics who promised contact with the lost. But then came the signal reports. The telegraph office on York Road began receiving faint transmissions at exactly midnight every Sunday. Old call signs, long retired since the war, pulsed through the wires, one of them unmistakably belonging to Thomas Ellard, the conductor dead half a century. Each message ended with the same phrase: tickets confirmed, line active. The ministry hushed the reports, but the whisper spread faster than truth could chase it, and deep beneath the city, the necropolis line stirred again. The parlor of glass. In Bloomsbury, within a narrow townhouse draped in lace and tobacco smoke, Madame Corvina held her nightly circles. Once a celebrated medium for grieving war widows, her clientele had thinned until she announced something new. A message, she told the gathered mourners, one rain-soaked night, from the other side of the rail. Her guests exchanged uneasy glances. Corvina smiled thinly and produced a small brass token from her palm. This was left at my door. It bears no maker's mark, only 2 words. She turned it in the candlelight. Platform waiting. The seance began. Hands joined. Candles flickered. The table quivered once, then stilled. When Corvina spoke again, her voice wasn't her own. He rides the midnight rails. The clock strikes 12, and the city forgets another name. One of the guests fainted. Another, a young journalist named Arthur Penn, scribbled every word. By dawn, the Daily Mirror ran his story. The cemetery line, London's train for the dead. The reporters trail Arthur Penn was not a superstitious man. He believed in ink, in type, and in what people would pay to read, not in ghosts. But when the ministry sent him a formal letter requesting the retraction of his article, stamped with the crest of Transport Investigation Bureau, he knew he destruck something real. Penn began digging. He found archived photographs of the Necropolis station from 1901, grim, empty platforms, and a procession of black-coated men loading coffins into carriages bound for Brookwood Cemetery. He found reports of collapses, accidents, and missing workers who had supposedly fallen into unfinished sections, and in a locked file deep in the municipal archives, he found Inspector Henry Calthorpe's personal effects, a cracked pocket watch, and a page torn from a field report. Contact made with Ellard. Train operates beyond temporal regulation. Recommend sealing entire southern tunnel network. The line returns every 300 nights. Penn's hand shook as he traced the last words. The date on the page read March 3rd, 1924. 300 nights from then would be January 27th, 1925, only 5 days away. The midnight experiment. He gathered a small group of volunteers, a telegraph operator, a railway historian, and Madame Corvina herself. They met in secret at the sealed Waterloo Tunnel entrance at 11:45 p.m. on the predicted night. Penn set up his recording device. Corvina lit 3 candles and placed the brass token on the ground. At 12 a.m., the first whistle sounded low, distant, impossibly deep, like the breath of something buried. The telegraph operator froze. "We're receiving something," he whispered. Dots and dashes flared across his machine. Tickets confirmed. Line active, then silence. And from the darkness of the sealed tunnel came the faint echo of wheels. Corvina whispered, "He's coming." The air grew colder. Their lanterns dimmed. Penn raised his microphone, heart hammering, and then froze. Because in the flicker of his candle, he saw a reflection in the tunnel glass. A man in uniform, cap, low gloved hands. And behind him, an endless carriage filled with faces pressed to the windows, pale, waiting, remembering. The telegraph clicked once more. Next passenger, Arthur Penn, the missing reporter, by morning. The experimenters were found unconscious near the sealed tunnel gate. Madame Corvina awoke, screaming. The telegraph operator had gone completely mute. Penn was missing. The police report stated only subject presumed, escaped, or lost within restricted section. Search inconclusive. But Corvina knew better. She returned to her parlor and found her mirror cracked clean down the center. On the glass, written in faint steam, were 3 words, "Tickets, please, Arthur." The city below, 2 weeks later, strange disturbances swept the underground. Passengers claimed to hear a second whistle after the final night train, a low, sorrowful note that vibrated through the rails. An engine driver swore he saw an unscheduled carriage ahead of him on the same track, old, black, no lights but one lantern swinging from its side. It vanished at the next bend. The ministry shut down the Waterloo extension indefinitely. Official statement, maintenance and electrical renewal. Unofficially, workers were leaving in droves. They said the tunnels weren't safe, that sometimes when you looked into the glass of a dark carriage, your reflection didn't blink back. The listener in Whitehall. In an office high above Whitehall, Sir Edmund Kean, chief of the Bureau of Transport, listened to the recordings recovered from Penn's equipment. Only one section contained audible words. A male voice, calm and steady, speaking through the hum of static. The dead arrive on time. The living are merely delayed. Kean frowned and rewound the wax cylinder. Again the same phrase. He stopped it midway. The voice changed subtly on the last word. Quieter, familiar. The living are merely delayed. Sir Edmund. Kean froze. No one outside the bureau knew his name. He leaned forward. "Who is this?" he whispered, and somewhere in the static, the faint sound of a watch ticking answered him. The final passenger list by summer. London's papers had stopped printing the stories. Too many disappearances, too many questions. Yet, in the archives of Brookwood Cemetery, a new ledger appeared, unsigned, its cover bound in soot-black leather. Inside, each page bore 2 columns, name and date of departure. Some were names of the missing, some had not yet vanished, and at the bottom of the final page, one name was freshly written: Sir Edmund Kean, passenger, departure pending. The last whistle that winter, a heavy fog smothered London. Commuters at Waterloo claimed the clocks froze at midnight for exactly 1 minute. Then, from beneath the earth, a deep rumble rose like thunder under stone. Those awake near the river reported seeing steam hiss through the pavement cracks, glowing faintly blue in the fog. And from somewhere unseen, a single whistle blew, long, mournful, endless. No one saw the train, but the next morning, on the wall of the old station's sealed arch, someone had written in coal dust, "The line is active, returns in 300 nights, the mirror train." There's a story now, passed quietly among London's underground workers, about the reflection that sometimes follows you when you ride the last train home. They say if you ever see an empty carriage pull alongside yours, perfectly parallel, don't look directly into the window, because in that glass, someone might already be sitting in your seat, waiting. And if you hear a whisper behind you, soft as coal dust falling, "Tickets, please, just close your eyes. The train's not for you, not yet." End of Chapter 5, The Cemetery Line. Chapter 6, The Man Who Painted the Whistle, a studio beneath the fog in the winter of 1926. On a narrow lane off Lambeth Bridge, there lived a painter named Edwin Vale, a quiet, hollow-cheeked man who spoke little and painted much. His studio sat above a coffin-maker's workshop, and the smell of varnish and wood glue climbed through his floorboards day and night. It was a smell he didn't mind. He said it kept the silence polite. Edwin had once painted for the Royal Academy portraits of minor aristocrats, stiff military men, women in lace. But after the influenza epidemic, his commissions stopped. He began painting strangers from memory, faces he swore he had never met. And lately, there was a new subject creeping into his work. A long, dark carriage with no horses. It appeared behind figures in alleyways, reflected in puddles, or glowing faintly beneath bridges. Always the same, a black train, a single lantern, and a faint curl of smoke, rising not upward, but downward. When a buyer asked what it meant, Vale only smiled. "It's not a what," he said, "it's a when." The visitor from the ministry on a fog-heavy morning, as Edwin mixed paint the color of dying roses. A knock came at the door. A man stood there in a gray coat, tall, lean, official. He introduced himself as Mr. Langford from the Bureau of Transport, a department Edwin didn't know existed. Langford spoke carefully. He had been monitoring certain artistic trends since the incident at Waterloo the previous year. He produced a file of photographs, dozens of sketches, and newspaper clippings of trains, clocks, stations, tunnels. All of them resembled Edwin's paintings. "You've never been shown these before?" Langford asked. Edwin frowned. "No." "Then how do you explain it?" Edwin hesitated. "Dreams," he said at last. "I paint what I dream." Langford's eyes lingered on a canvas by the window, a half-finished portrait of a woman standing before a train, her reflection staring back from a dark window. "Do you know who she is?" Edwin's brush trembled. "I think she's waiting for someone." Langford closed his file and said softly, "Mr. Vale, that's Madame Corvina. She's been dead for 6 months." The whistle that hummed that night, Edwin couldn't sleep. The gaslights flickered, and his brushes, laid neatly across the table, rattled as though disturbed by a small tremor. He rose and went to the window. The fog outside was so thick it blurred the lamps into floating spheres. From somewhere in that mist came a sound, low, mournful, distant, a whistle. It wasn't the sharp cry of a factory horn or a ship. It was deeper, more deliberate, as if calling a name. Edwin lit his lamp and returned to his easel. His hand began to move without thought, guided by a rhythm he didn't recognize. When the brush stopped, he stepped back and froze. On the canvas was not the fogged street, but a platform, slick with rain. A single clock above the arch read 12 o'clock, and standing beneath it was Arthur Penn, the missing journalist, staring directly out of the painting, holding a ticket in his hand. At the bottom corner, where Edwin always signed his name, new letters appeared, written not by him, but pressed as if from within the paint itself. Platform waiting. The mirror in the studio days blurred into nights. Edwin stopped eating. He painted in silence, driven by something unseen. Visitors said the smell of oil paint had changed, sharper, metallic, like blood on old iron. One morning, his landlady, Mrs. Dunn, came to collect rent and found him staring into a large mirror propped against the wall. The reflection showed him sitting at the easel, but the version of him in the glass was painting something different. A black carriage moving through mist, the lantern flickering blue. "Mr. Vale," she whispered. He didn't turn. His reflection did. It smiled at her. Mrs. Dunn screamed and fled. When she returned with the constable, the mirror was shattered, but in each shard, she could still see the train continuing on as if through countless little windows. The letter, a week later, Langford returned. The studio door was ajar. Inside, dozens of canvases leaned against the walls, every one of them showing the same tunnel, the same train, the same faces pressed to the glass. On the table, beneath a small brass token was a letter addressed to whoever hears the whistle. Langford read, "It isn't death they fear, it's being forgotten. The train runs not to carry souls away, but to remember them. Each whistle is a name spoken again, and each painting another face returned to light." He turned the letter over. A smear of soot formed a faint outline of a handprint. There was no sign of Edwin Vale, only his last painting, still wet, a train pulling away from a platform, one open window, and inside it Edwin himself, brush in hand, looking back. At the bottom corner, fresh words shimmered beneath the varnish. Next passenger, Edwin Vale. The Collector by 1927. The story of the cemetery train painter had become a myth. His surviving canvases were bought quietly by collectors who claimed to feel the air move when they passed by them. One was purchased by an American industrialist who hung it in his New York townhouse. Within a month, his servants swore they heard distant train whistles from the walls. Another ended up in a chapel near Brookwood Cemetery. Visitors said the train in the painting grew longer each time they looked, and the final piece, disappeared into the archives of the Bureau of Transport. Langford sealed it in a crate labeled Temporal Artifacts, Unclassified. But when he returned years later to catalog it, the crate was empty. Only a faint smell of turpentine remained, and a single rail ticket lying at the bottom, its ink still fresh. The whistle that never stops there are railway workers now, who say that sometimes, when the fog rolls low over the Thames, they hear a whistle that seems to come from the air itself, not echoing, but resonating inside their chest. Some claim it hums in the same key as a painter's sigh. Old Mrs. Dunn lived to 93. In her final years, she often stared into her window glass and whispered, "He's still painting, you know, just not here." And when she passed, her grandson swore he found a tiny sketch tucked beneath her pillow, a drawing of a train platform and a man waving from its door. The return ticket. 3 centuries later, when engineers finally reopened a forgotten tunnel near Waterloo for modernization, they found a wall sealed with brick and lime. Behind it, buried in dust, was a mirror perfectly intact, and reflected inside that mirror, faint but unmistakable, was a train crawling slowly toward the glass. Its windows glowed, its wheels turned, and as one of the engineers leaned closer, he swore he saw a man at the conductor's stand, an artist, brush raised, painting the tunnel as they stood there. Then the whistle blew, the mirror cracked. End of Chapter 6. The Man Who Painted the Whistle. Chapter 7. The Engineer's Lament, The Ministry Orders. By late 1927, the Ministry of Transport could no longer ignore the reports. Commuters swore they heard phantom whistles, clocks froze, and workers disappeared overnight. The Necropolis line had grown too dangerous to leave sealed. Sir Edmund Kean, still haunted by his near-encounter years prior, convened a team: civil engineers, tunnelers, and ministry inspectors. Their orders were simple: reinforce the southern tunnels, install temporal stabilizers, experimental devices meant to suppress residual echoes, record all anomalies and contain them if possible. The engineers knew little about ghosts. They knew less about time slipping sideways. But each man understood fear and the fog that seemed thicker in those abandoned corridors, whispered constantly in their ears. The lead engineer, Henry Wallace, a former railway officer, led the project. Tall, thin, perpetually hunched over maps, he had spent years digging tunnels under London. When Wallace first descended to the necropolis platform, he saw something that made him hesitate. The bricks, the rails, the lamps, all familiar yet wrong. The station appeared older than any record, as if it had grown backward through time. His assistant, Thomas Greaves, whispered, "It's the dead still building it themselves." Wallace ignored him. But that night, alone in the archway, he swore he heard a soft tap-tap, a rhythm like a train approaching. The stabilizers. The ministry's devices were crude, but sophisticated enough to impress engineers. Large coils, copper rods, and oscillating dials, placed at intervals along the tunnel, they hummed faintly, vibrating through the stone like a heartbeat. The plan was simple: suppress the spectral presence, force the line to sleep. But as Wallace adjusted the dials, the air grew cold. A whistle echoed faintly, coming not from the tunnel, but from inside the stabilizer itself. He stared at the metal. The humming wasn't random. It formed a rhythm. Tick-tick, pause, tick-tick, he realized, with a cold certainty that something was learning from them. The first casualty on the second night, a worker named James Holloway, disappeared. One moment he was tightening a rail brace. The next, only his boots remained. The search revealed nothing, only the faint smell of damp coal and a single brass ticket lying on the ground. James Holloway, passenger. Panic spread among the crew. Men refused to descend into the tunnel alone. Yet the line still moved. Lanterns swung where no wind blew. Shadows crawled along the walls. Wallace knew this wasn't mechanical failure. It was conscious, and it was watching them. Whispers in the stone each night, the engineers recorded strange phenomena. Metal tools disappearing only to reappear in different tunnels. Shadows moving against the flow of lamps. Whistles sounding in perfect 12-second intervals, even in empty corridors. The workers began whispering about a figure, a man in a conductor's coat, always standing at the far end of the tunnel, cap low, observing them. Wallace argued it was imagination, but when he followed the figure, it vanished into a wall. Some said the train itself walked the tunnels now, independent of rails. Messages in the dark, then came the notes. tiny slips of paper tucked into helmet straps, toolboxes, or under lamps. You cannot fix what remembers. Passengers never leave early. The whistle chooses the living. Wallace pocketed one and stared at it for hours. The handwriting was impossibly precise, yet shifted subtly when read twice. It became clear the Necropolis line was no longer just a train. It was a will, an entity feeding on memory, time, and fear. The engineer's lament one night, Wallace wrote in his journal. We dug tunnels, laid rails, and thought we could tame time itself. We thought we could lock ghosts behind bricks. But the line remembers more than we ever will. And now, I fear, it remembers us. That night, he dreamed of the train. It moved silently through the fog, carriages stretching infinitely, lanterns glowing blue. Inside, he saw every man who had ever vanished on the line. Workers, journalists, mediums, painters. They turned their faces to him. Not angry, not pleading, just waiting. And from the last carriage, a familiar hand waved. The conductor, Thomas Ellard, pale, wax-like, smiling faintly. The line awakens. By 1928, the ministry had abandoned the project. The official report cited structural instability, though engineers whispered it was something older than bricks and steel. Yet the line was active. Every night at midnight, workers reported a soft rumble below, faint enough that it could be ignored until the whistle sounded. And the whistle no longer belonged to a person. It belonged to the train. It had learned the city. It had learned the people. It remembered the living, and it would call them when the time was right. A legacy of fear letters arrived years later from engineers who had survived. I hear it still. When the fog rolls over the Thames, I hear the wheels. I see the lanterns. I know someone is looking at me, and I cannot leave the whistle alone. Some of the letters contained sketches, diagrams of tunnels, of rails curving impossibly into the fog. One sketch showed a figure painting on a platform as the train passed beneath, brush in hand, face calm, waiting for the next passenger. Even in retirement, the memory haunted them. Every shadow, every whistle, every reflection in glass brought it back, the final echo. The Necropolis line still sleeps beneath London. Every now and then, when the fog is thick, lanterns flicker along sealed platforms. Some claim to see the train moving slowly, gliding through forgotten tunnels, carrying faces pressed to the glass. And those who descend into the old lines, whether by curiosity or misfortune, sometimes return with stories of tools moving themselves, whispers in the stone, and brass tickets left on the ground. One message, scrawled on the tunnel wall in soot, endures. We remember the living, and the living will remember us. End of Chapter 7. The Engineer's Lament. Chapter 8. The Midnight Cartographer. The map maker arrives by early 1929. The city's underground networks had grown ever more complex. Steam lines, sewer tunnels, and abandoned passages intertwined like veins beneath London's fog-drenched streets. Enter Alistair Penrose, a young cartographer employed by the ministry to map these subterranean networks. Tall, pale, and meticulous, he had a reputation for patience and precision, a man who could chart chaos and find order. He was given the assignment nobody wanted: document the necropolis line. Most engineers avoided it. Most workers refused to descend. But Penrose saw opportunity, a chance to make a name for himself, and, as he soon learned, a chance to confront something far older than steel and stone. The ledger of paths. Penrose's first day was spent in the archives, poring over old ministry documents. He found field sketches by Wallace, logbooks by Langford, and the faint ink trails of Edwin Vale's paintings. One page, torn and water-stained, read, "Rails do not follow the city. The city follows the rails. Watch for the reflections." This cryptic note haunted Penrose. He realized that mapping the necropolis line would not be like mapping ordinary tunnels. The line seemed alive, shifting subtly in response to observation. At night, shadows in his office moved along the edges of the maps. Sometimes the pencil marks appeared altered, routes redrawn overnight without his touch. First descent, Penrose gathered a small team: a geologist, a former railway worker, and a clerk from the ministry archives. They descended into the sealed necropolis tunnels at midnight. The platform looked as expected: wet stone, iron rails, and faint echoes of past passengers. But the train did not appear, not yet. As they advanced, the tunnels began to bend unnaturally. Stalactites formed where none should exist. Puddles reflected sections of the city above that did not exist anymore. The deeper they went, the more the line seemed to anticipate them, shifting in ways that made maps useless. Penrose felt a rising panic. "This is not just a line," he whispered. "It's a mind." The first sight, hours into their survey, they encountered a carriage lying across an impossible junction. It glowed faintly blue. No lantern swung, no engine moved it. Inside, they saw passengers, not alive, not dead, but paused in motion, as though the world had forgotten to continue for them. Faces pressed to glass, one hand raised mid-waves. Penrose felt the pull of the train, subtle but insistent. He took out a notebook and sketched furiously. Suddenly, a whistle echoed, so soft it was almost a thought. The carriage vanished. The tunnels shifted. The maps in Penrose's hands changed. Lines twisted. Paths that once led to water pumps now ended in solid rock. Letters in the stone they found writing etched into the walls. Faint letters in soot and chalk. Maps are lies. The line remembers its passengers. Watch your step. One of the workers laughed nervously. Ha! Someone's playing tricks. But Penrose knew better. The letters moved when no one looked. Maps shifted overnight. The line was reactive, aware, conscious. Even their flashlights seemed reluctant to illuminate certain tunnels. Shadows clung unnaturally to corners, forming vague shapes of passengers waiting for a ride. The passenger ledger Penrose discovered a ledger hidden behind a loose brick. Names filled the pages, men and women long missing, including Edwin Vale, Arthur Penn, and James Holloway. Each had a departure date written in faint ink. Some were crossed out, others were pending. On the last page, a fresh entry had appeared since their descent. Alistair Penrose, passenger. The room grew cold. The whistle sounded again, soft, deliberate, directed at him. The reality shift as they mapped. Penrose noticed the tunnels themselves reacting. Passages shortened, then stretched impossibly long. Platforms appeared where none existed. Walls shifted when unobserved. The train's route seemed aware of their gaze. The line isn't underground, Penrose whispered to his team. It's everywhere, beneath, above, inside the city. It's sentient. A shadow passed across the ceiling. Tall, uniformed, gloved hands folded. Thomas Ellard. The conductor speaks. Ellard's voice echoed in the tunnel. You chart what cannot be contained. You see what is not yours to see. The whistle sounded again, louder now, vibrating through Penrose's chest. The air shimmered. Walls of stone appeared liquid. The floor rippled. Penrose tried to sketch faster, but the pencil trembled violently. The ledger in his backpack flipped open on its own. Pages turned. The ink reformed. Next passenger, Alistair Penrose. The map becomes the trap. Penrose realized every map drawn, every line sketched, became part of the train's memory. The line learned, adapted, and trapped those who attempted to chart it. The tunnels seemed endless. No one could retrace steps exactly. Maps in the daylight were blank. The city above continued, unaware, while below the train moved, collecting passengers, absorbing memories, folding space around itself. Even the ministry reports could not explain it. Every attempt to report or survey ended in confusion or disappearance. The silent return. Weeks later, the tunnels were sealed once more. The ministry issued an official statement. Project deemed unsafe. Tunnels closed for structural inspection. Penrose was never seen again. His maps were recovered blank. But workers claim that on foggy nights, when the Thames wind cuts across Waterloo, a man in a coat and cap can be glimpsed moving along the walls of the sealed tunnels, sketchbook in hand, pencil glowing faintly, and always, faintly, beneath the city, the whistle. Tickets, please. End of Chapter 8, The Midnight Cartographer. Chapter 9, The Final Journey. London, October 30th, 1929. The air was thick with fog, that heavy, grainy kind that turns street lamps into halos and cobblestones into wet mirrors. The city was quiet, as if holding its breath before All Hallows Eve, and beneath it all, below the hum of trams and the rustle of tired shoes, something old stirred on the disused Northern Line. Thomas Hale sat alone in his narrow office at the London Transport Records Bureau, a man of order, of logic, of timetables and measurements. For 10 years, he had chased what his colleagues called the death train story, an urban legend older than the tube itself. But to Hale, it was no mere tale. He had the ledgers, he had the sound recordings, he had the dates. October 31st, 1871, first reported sighting. October 31st, 1890, second appearance. October 31st, 1910, third. Next expected interval, 1929. He had circled the date in red ink 3 years prior. Now the hour was near. The bureau had long since emptied. Records slept behind locked cabinets, and the only sound was the slow tick of the station clock, the kind that sounded too loud when you were alone. Hale packed his satchel, a small thermos, a notepad, a flashlight, and an old brass watch once owned by his father, a train conductor himself. Lost on duty in 1902 during a tunnel collapse near Bishopsgate. That collapse, Hale suspected, was no accident. At precisely 11:50 p.m., he locked the bureau door behind him and began the walk through narrow gaslit streets to Bishopsgate Station. The city above was sleeping, but the ground beneath seemed to hum faintly, as though restless. He felt it in the soles of his shoes, a vibration almost musical, like distant rails. The descent, the disused entrance to Bishopsgate Tunnel, lay behind an iron gate near the freight yard. Hale had the keys. He'd borrowed them weeks earlier under the guise of historical inspection. The padlock creaked, the gate groaned, and stale air rolled out like breath from a crypt. The walls were lined with blackened bricks, dripping with condensation. His lantern caught the faint shimmer of old graffiti, initials, dates, railway insignias that hadn't been touched in decades. Rats scurried somewhere out of sight, their squeaks blending with the whisper of wind through broken ducts. He marked each step with care, counting his pace, a habit from years of documenting forgotten tunnels. 327 steps down before the stairwell opened into an immense void. The cemetery line platform. It stretched before him like a skeleton of a station, rails corroded, benches broken, yet eerily intact. And there, at the far end, a faint light flickered, moving slowly, rhythmically. Couldn't be, he whispered. There hasn't been power here in 20 years, yet the light grew brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. The arrival at 12:03 a.m., the air changed. It was no longer damp but cold, dry and ancient, like the breath of stone catacombs. The ground trembled slightly. Then came a sound, the low metallic groan of distant wheels against rusted tracks. Then a whistle, long, mournful, human. Through the fog ahead, the train emerged. It was beautiful, impossibly so. Brass polished like moonlight, windows rimmed in silver frost, no soot, no grime. It seemed untouched by time. And yet, when it stopped, Hale could see faces pressed to the windows, pale, wide-eyed, unmoving, not passengers waiting to arrive, but souls who had never left. The doors opened with a hiss, and standing there was the conductor in black, tall, gaunt, face obscured beneath a brimmed hat. No lantern, no eyes visible, only the faint reflection of Hale's own light against polished buttons. The conductor gave a slow nod. "Thomas Hale," a voice said, not aloud, but inside his head. "Your ticket has been waiting." Hale's hand trembled as he lifted his father's brass watch. The second hand was still ticking, though the train's shadow had no reflection on it. He stepped forward, one foot on the platform, one on the train. The conductor turned, the door closed. Inside the train, it was silent, not merely quiet, silent. Each compartment glowed with a dull amber light. Passengers sat perfectly still, their faces gray and soft, like smoke trapped behind glass. Some wore Victorian coats, others Edwardian hats, eras mismatched, united only by that same empty gaze. Hale's breath fogged the window. His reflection flickered faintly, like a candle guttering out. He walked down the aisle, his shoes echoing on marble floors. Luggage compartments were full of old letters, dusty clocks, and folded photographs. Every so often, a faint whisper would ripple through the air. Not speech, but memory. The 11:42 eternity. "Hold tight, sir, mind the gap." Each phrase spoken in a different century's accent. Hale reached the last carriage. There, on a velvet seat, lay an object wrapped in linen, small, rectangular. He lifted it gently. It was a mirror. Its surface shimmered not with his reflection, but with flickering scenes of London streets, of crowds, of himself walking these tunnels years ago. And then he saw it, his father's face, staring out from the other side, lips moving soundlessly. The conductor appeared behind him. "He waited for you," the voice said. "Every conductor needs an heir." The train jolted. Outside, the tunnels blurred, then vanished, replaced by streaks of gray light, endless as fog. Hale realized with calm horror that the train was no longer underground. It was moving through memory. The final stop. Time unraveled. He saw decades flash by in moments, stations rising and collapsing, the world rebuilding itself. The faces beside him began to fade, each replaced by another. But he felt no fear now, only quiet acceptance. He turned once more to the conductor. Will they remember us? Only when the rails hum came the answer. Only when they listened. As the train began to slow, he looked down at his watch. The brass casing gleamed softly. The hands had stopped at 3:15 a.m. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, and Hale stepped forward into darkness. Epilogue fragment, 1974, 50 years later. During an expansion of the London Underground Archives, engineers discovered a sealed tunnel behind Bishopsgate. Inside, on a rusted bench, was found a satchel. Within it, a notebook, a thermos, and an old brass watch stopped at 3:15, written on the first page. In steady ink, the rails go deeper than earth. The passengers do not end. The timetable continues. Thomas Hale, and at the bottom of the page, a faint stamp. The cemetery line, London Necropolis Transit Co. No such company ever existed. Chapter 10, Reflections of the Departed. The silence after the whistle when the noise stopped. London seemed to exhale. For weeks following Thomas Hale's disappearance, Bishopsgate Station felt emptier than usual, though no official reason was ever recorded. The workers said the ground trembled at odd hours, that the fog lingered longer on the eastern platforms. A constable reported hearing a whistle near the graveyard gates one night, soft, distant, and far too old-fashioned for the modern rails. They said it must have been a wind tunnel. They always said it was something else. The year was 1930, and the city was shedding its ghosts for steel and neon. Yet there, beneath the progress, the tunnels still sighed. No one walked the old Northern Service line anymore. The maps erased it, the timetables forgot it. But the rails remembered. The investigation months later, a young archivist named Eleanor Whitcomb joined the Bureau. She was 27, precise in her speech, and carried her curiosity like armor. Hale's name appeared often in her first assignments: handwritten ledgers, fragmentary letters, and that curious final entry, "The rails go deeper than earth." At first, she thought him a romantic. By her second month, she thought him right. Her investigation began with photographs, ones that had been mislabeled or misfiled for decades. Old station surveys from 1870 to 1910, many showing ghostly blurs on long exposures, faces where no one had stood, a light like a lantern where there was no reflection. In one photograph, a panoramic of the Bishopsgate Freight Tunnel, taken on October 31st, 1890, she found a faint outline of a man holding a watch. The hands were visible, even in the blur, 3:15, and in the next frame, he was gone. The mirror test her office was small, a corner room lined with paper and silence. On her third week studying Hale's notes, the gaslight flickered, and something on her desk caught the glow. A small mirror mounted on a cracked wooden frame. It had been part of Hale's recovered satchel. though no mention of it appeared in the official inventory. At first glance, it was ordinary, a century old at least, but when she leaned closer, she noticed the reflection was slightly slow. Her hand would move, then a moment later, the mirror would follow. It was like watching herself in another time. She wrote in her log that night, "The glass feels heavy, as though remembering too much light." She began testing it. Each night, she sat before it and recorded what she saw. Night 1, nothing. Night 2, flicker of lanterns, too dim to be from the room. Night 3, smoke behind her, though the window was shut. Night 4, a faint whistle. And on the 5th night, when she leaned close enough to fog the glass, she saw rails. The return of the conductor, the image deepened. The mirror was no longer showing her reflection, but the interior of a train carriage, empty seats, dim lamps, and fog pressing against the windows. Then, as if the image had been waiting for her attention, the door at the end of the carriage slid open. The conductor in black stepped into view. He looked directly at her through the glass, the brim of his hat hiding everything but the faint outline of a mouth. And in that faint motion, she thought he whispered something. She leaned closer. "Your ticket, Miss Whitcomb." She fell back, knocking over her chair. The mirror cracked, but no sound followed. Only the steady hum, the sound of an underground train rolling far beneath the floorboards. The next morning, the mirror was spotless again. Not a single crack, only a faint residue shaped like the outline of a gloved hand. The collector's letter weeks later, Eleanor received a parcel with no return address. Inside was an envelope, yellowed and soft, marked "To whom the timetable calls." The handwriting was Hale's. The letter read, "The conductor does not collect the living, only those who hear the whistle in silence. The train is a promise made to time itself. When the mirror stirs, it is already too late to look away." Enclosed was a photograph, Bishopsgate Station, 1929. In the distance, barely visible, a figure was boarding the train. The light blurred, but in the corner of the frame, she saw something that froze her blood. Her own face reflected in the train window. The station that should not exist, determined to prove the illusion false. Eleanor requested access to the sealed tunnels beneath the city. Officials denied her 3 times. On her 4th attempt, she went alone. She entered through a service hatch near Farringdon, under the guise of archiving blueprints. For hours, she traced the old lines, dripping brick, collapsed air shafts, the remains of half-buried signs, Bishopsgate Necropolis line. Her lantern flickered once, twice. Then came the faintest echo, a whistle. She turned a corner and saw light. There, impossibly intact, stood the platform, dustless, bright, alive, with a golden haze. The rails shimmered faintly, like heated glass, and down the track came the train. No sound of metal, only the low rhythm of heartbeat and breath. The carriage of the forgotten. When the doors opened, the interior smelled faintly of lilac and coal dust. She stepped inside, her heartbeat echoing like a drum. Rows of passengers turned their heads toward her. Not all were whole. Some faces were unfinished, as if memory itself had sculpted them halfway. Among them sat Thomas Hale, eyes calm, hands folded over his satchel. He nodded once. The bureau always finds its own. "Am I dead?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Not yet. The timetable runs both ways, but only one arrives." The conductor appeared again, silent this time, and set the mirror in her lap. In its reflection, she saw not the train, but the city above London, awake and unaware. Then, like a breath exhaled, the lights dimmed. The return 3 days later. Workers repairing a gas main near Bishopsgate discovered an open tunnel not listed on any schematic. Inside lay Eleanor's satchel, her notebook, and a small, perfectly preserved mirror. The mirror was cold to the touch, even under direct sunlight. When moved, it reflected not the men working above, but a platform lit by amber lamps, and a figure watching from the edge. Her face was calm, her eyes open. Behind her, the train waited, silent, eternal, the modern reflection. It is said that in the archives of the London Transport Museum, there is a file that no one catalogues, case number 4137B, the cemetery train. Inside are Hale's journal pages, Eleanor's notes, and the mirror sealed in black cloth. Visitors sometimes claim that when the room is quiet enough, they can hear distant rails. The staff smile politely. They don't work alone after dark. One curator wrote in 1986, "I cleaned the mirror today. There were fingerprints inside the glass." And so, dear listener, if you walk home through the fog-laced streets of London and hear a whistle long past midnight, remember, not all stations were meant to close, and not every passenger has returned. The cemetery train still keeps its schedule. Its conductor still nods to those who listen too long. So, before you drift to sleep tonight, take one last look at the mirror near your bedside. If it feels heavy, if it hums faintly, or if you catch the shadow of a carriage passing through the reflection, don't be afraid. Just whisper, "Not tonight, sir," and close your eyes, for the rails run deeper than dreams. Tranquil Arc Chronicles, endless histories for sleepless nights.